All right, I think we are live. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to Red Pepper Magazine's first Lockdown Live event on the social and political power of gaming. For all of those who don't know, Red Pepper is a quarterly magazine. It's specifically focused on the British left, and we have been around for 25 years. And actually, in those 25 years, we have literally never covered gaming until now. So that's quite momentous for us. And I know that today we have gamers and non-gamers tuning in. So rest assured, the next hour will not be entirely us geeking out. We'll touch on a lot of progressive issues that might be of interest to non-gamers. We'll talk about labor struggles for game workers. We'll cover Gamergate and all kinds of political battles around identity, diversity, feminism, politics, and even hopefully touch on the role of the military in shaping the gaming industry. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our really, really amazing group of panelists. All of them are Red Pepper contributors, and their articles are currently live on our website. So we've got Carolyn Petit, who is a veteran game critic. She also hosted this really brilliant series that you all should check out called Queer Tropes versus Video Games. And she's a regular commentator on Feminist Frequency. So Carolyn, thank you for joining us. We've also got Sher Jamal, who writes about music, culture, and social justice. He's also an amazing member of the Radical Communicators Network, and he's a comm strategist based out of New York City. Great to have you with us, Jamal.
Thanks,
and then we've got Paolo Ruffino, who is a lecturer at the University of Liverpool here in the UK, where he does research and writes about the video game industry. And he's the author of a book called Future Gaming, which I highly, highly recommend. I've read it. It's awesome. And
thank you. Cheers.
So we'll be taking questions from the audience at the end. So if you guys are tuning in, please feel free to pop in your burning questions on Facebook and YouTube. We're so excited to hear them. Okay, so let's dig into the topic and turn it over to our panelists. So, just I guess for some background, video games are now, even if you're skeptical, video games are now really one of the most influential entertainment industries in the world. I mean, we're talking about 2.5 billion people playing games around the globe. The industry is bringing in a lot of money, honestly, more than global music sales. It's outpacing many cinema franchises. But for many of us on the left and in progressive circles, I think gaming culture, unless you're in it, is sort of a black box. And there are a lot of stereotypes about who gamers are, who games are made for, and a lot of this still lingers in our popular imagination. And so I want to turn it over to you, Jamal, because you wrote about this tension in your article, and the fact that who games are made for versus who plays them is at the crux of much deeper political debates. So can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Sure. One thing I really wanted to highlight in my article was just that, games are ubiquitous at this point in this cultural moment. We have 2.5 billion people who are playing games, and that definition describes games like Words with Friends. It describes gacha games on cell phones, which are kind of, loot box games that could be just very narratively driven, as well as what we more traditionally think of as games like Call of Duty or console shooters or militarized games. So to understand where we are now, we have to kind of have this broadened definition of games to see games as anything, but also games as something that could be very personal and speak to your personal experience. So that's why in my article, I really wanted to highlight Night in the Woods, which is a game that is about the Rust Belt and based in a fictionalized version of Pennsylvania, and about, growing up with mental illness and queer identities and dropping out of school and different things that could resonate with people on a very emotional individual scale, but might not be for everyone, for the average gamer, quote unquote.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to jump in a little bit on that, like it's I think so much of the cultural battle around video games over the past several years has really been about this idea of who games are for, and a more and people, queer people, trans people, people of color who have always loved games and played games, but who haven't been the people who games have been marketed to or games websites have targeted. This real centering of like the idea of the straight white male gamer, as limited as that is in terms of who games are actually played by or who enjoys games, definitely really created a feeling of like entitlement among a lot of straight white male gamers that became entrenched over a long period of time and resulted in a lot of vehement, vitriolic backlash and reactionary, energy when queer folks, trans folks, etc., started trying to assert like that. Hey, we want to take up space in this culture too. We love games too. It is, fascinating if you look at like the Atari era of games, like so like the like late 70s, early 80s. A lot of the advertising then, a lot of the imagery in Atari's advertising was families. Like it was moms and dads and kids like playing games together. And it wasn't just it wasn't like zoned in on like the young straight white male gamer to the degree that would come later. But then there was this video game crash in the early 80s. And when Nintendo saw an opportunity in the US to relaunch video games with the NES, they wanted to like distance themselves from what video games had been before. And so they branded the NES more as a toy than as a game initially. And it came with this like robot, Rob, the robotic operating buddy. And so that toy spin that they put on it meant kind of because toys were then and continue to be very gendered, the pink aisle and the blue aisle. And I think that that's part of culturally what led to the initial shift towards really like, games being marketed as or conceptualized primarily as more for boys and not as a family activity, a group activity, etc. And then that just as those boys got older, became teens and into their 20s, you saw that group like with the Sony PlayStation and just kind of that group continue to be targeted and centered in the way games were made, in the studios and the people who were making games were largely straight white men who were like, well, what would I like? Therefore, that's what I'm going to make in the game. And it just kind of had this snowball effect that continues, really, we can see the effects kind of through up to today.
If I can jump in on this, I think it's what you just described is probably one of the most important aspects of to really know how to look at the numbers that are so frequently presented by the game industry itself in relation to its popularity and its pervasiveness. And since I started looking into the game industry, there has always been almost every year at least one report or document claiming that the game industry is now bigger than cinema and music. There are now more women playing game than men. Of course, these numbers are encouraging from many points of view, but the relevance, I don't think it is not these numbers that really tell us something about the cultural relevance of video games. And if anything, they might actually have the opposite effect of, for instance, when looking at who games are for and who they're made by, we might tend to think that, for instance, diverse audiences just happen at some point in time. That now all of a sudden we have girls playing and making games. Well, that's a very problematic historical bias. And what we know it's been happening, and there are many researchers nowadays who have been kind of highlighting this problem, is that very diverse audiences have always been making and playing games, but there have been very very kind of strong strategies that have made these groups less visible or very marginalized. In the advertisement, for instance, of video games, or in the ways in which the industry talks about itself, by the game press as well. So the imagined consumer of the mainstream productions was almost always this sort of white, 18 to 35 years old boy, really. But we know, I mean, there are many examples. If you look, like some of my ex-colleagues from London Southbank University recently wrote this fantastic piece of research on the story of Yoko Shimomura. Yoko Shimomura was the designer of the soundtrack of Street Fighter, which is an iconic soundtrack, very influential for electronic music. And she's a woman. And she hid her own identity as a woman under a pseudonym in the credits of Street Fighter, because she kind of felt that it was the most appropriate thing to do, in a way, to self-censor her own presence as a woman. It was not really seen as appropriate, in a sense, to be a woman in the production of a soundtrack, of the soundtrack of a mainstream video game. Or even if you look at the work of Lane Nooney from NYU, who has been looking at the story of Roberta Williams at Sierra Online, one of the most influential game designers of the early 90s. Roberta Williams was very popular and famous. She made very popular games, but she was always treated as an exception, almost as a token for women in games, as a strange character that didn't really conform to the standards. So it was always singled out without acknowledging that, maybe there are other people and other ways of making games that are simply made invisible, that we don't look at them. So I think it's what's really important for us now is to look back at the history of the medium of the video game, and to really see that these numbers have always been there, and they've always played a role. And that's really, I think, what makes this that's, I think, the most critical and interesting way, really, to look at what we are currently told about the influence of the game industry.
It's interesting, because I think this element of tokenizing diversity, it feeds into so many different industries, sectors, areas of pop culture. We are okay with checkbox diversity, but if those individuals who are part of the gaming industry, who might be queer, who might be people of color, who might be women, who might be trans, start asking for games that are actually more representative of the kind of wider array of who's playing games, then there's backlash, right? That's a level of inclusion and diversity that we're not okay with, which sort of brings me to my next question, which is the fact that, Carolyn, you were literally in the eye of the storm during Gamergate. And I mean, we sort of can't talk about, for audiences that are just joining us now, welcome. We are running Red Pepper's first lockdown live event about the social and political power of video games. And so we can't really talk about the sort of modern history of video games and where we are today without talking about Gamergate and the kind of backlash that came against feminists, against queer people. I think, Carolyn, to quote you a bit from your interview, it's basically a backlash against anyone who was more critical of the toxic aspects of gaming culture. So, Carolyn, is Gamergate over, and what legacy has it left behind in the gaming industry?
Well, I think it's important to note that, Gamergate didn't, like, the sentiments that Gamergate represented, that coalesced around the hashtag of Gamergate, like, didn't just spring into being that day that the hashtag got coined. It was a thing that was building and simmering under the surface for a long time. And certainly I, as a trans woman in gaming spaces, was running up against what would come to be known as Gamergate long before it was called Gamergate. When I first started working at a major gaming website as a critic, immediately, there were people, readers, viewers of the website's content, sort of telling me that, explicitly, it's not even like in sort of subtext, but explicitly telling me that women in that space, should exist to be desirable to the straight male reader / viewer, and that by not, because I obviously wasn't hired, because as a trans woman, et cetera, like I obviously wasn't hired with that in mind. Like the site that hired me was sort of betraying its base. Like that was the level of like entitlement to that space that many had come to feel, many straight, primarily white men had come to feel. And that, again, that's the result of years and years of being so centered by gaming design, games marketing, by how the games media itself presented games and who they're for and what they're meant to be, that those ideas kind of calcified. And so, Gamergate happened. There will be books written analyzing Gamergate. It's a tremendously historically significant and complicated phenomenon that no like 1 hour panel discussion can really kind of fully unpack. But to be clear, like even though the hashtag and whatnot has kind of faded and is not really in use anymore, just as it didn't begin with that, it didn't end there either. I mean, we can look at there's right-wing YouTubers who create outrage about like, oh, the new She-Ra cartoon on Netflix, like the characters are clearly not designed in a way as to be like sexually appealing to male viewers, and this is a problem. Like, and they create this tremendous kind of outrage. But the thing is that they're right to think that there is political power and cultural power in how these things are framed, and that the sort of patriarchal notions that women do exist primarily to be, or that our value is determined by our desirability to men, like that those are somewhat threatened by media that frames women in different ways. But so just another example is just earlier this week, and I'm not going to state any specifics of the spoilers because I haven't looked at any specifics of the spoilers. But there was a big kerfuffle in gaming when plot details of the upcoming Last of Us 2 game, huge video game blockbuster sequel, were leaked. And there's definitely outrage among some that apparently that the game we already know has a queer cis female character among its leads. Apparently there is at least one trans character or other, or trans characters as well. And you have this, these statements of attacking that as like a political decision, as an agenda-driven decision. But, you never hear about the political, as if centering straight white men in 98% of the media that most of us have consumed all of our lives isn't itself a political act, a political decision, that informs our ideas of whose stories are worth being told, of who is most relatable. When I was, in the thick of my work with Feminist Frequency during our Tropes versus Women in Video Games video series, people would sometimes mockingly say to me something like, oh yeah, why don't you just make a video game about a disabled Black, like Muslim, trans woman? And what's so revealing about that, statements like that, is that it's them like telling on themselves, because it reveals that to them, like straight white man has become like the default setting on humanity, the center. And that for each, like, as if you're in a character creator in a video game, and for each variant that you choose that moves you away from that, like, oh, Black, like female, disabled, Muslim, whatever, like you are somehow becoming more like moved away from the default or the center of humanity, whereas like there is no default setting on humanity, and no human is more or less human than any other human, and Black, disabled, trans, Muslim women like are equally as deserving of being centered in video games as straight cis white men. But and so this is part of the power of media, and how it works to center our ideas about, again, whose stories are worth being told, who's most human, who's most relatable. And Gamergate continues, even though it doesn't still it doesn't have that name being used anymore, continues to manifest in these cultural battles about like who media should center and be about.
I think we should also be blunt for the non-gamers that Gamergate has very deep connections to white nationalist and alt-right movements. I think it was Milo Yiannopoulos was Breitbart's tech editor, right? Was hired as
yes. Sorry, I just like you mentioned Steve Bannon, who was Trump's original I forget what his chief advisor, I think was his title. Like he saw the potential in gamer anger as something that could be harnessed. And so he hired Milo Yiannopoulos to be Breitbart's tech editor, even though Milo is not a tech person at all. It really meant like he was hired to write like anti-feminist screeds that used gaming as a way really to channel that and bring those people from gamer rage to like Trump, really like Trump supporters and like far right political actors.
Right. And I think it also shows just like how politically insidious the Gamergate movement could be, where it kind of starts with this kernel of truth or something that seems like it should be fundamentally true. So on the alt-right, Jordan Peterson says to young men, clean your room. And you're like, yeah, of course, I'll clean my room. And with Gamergate, it was like gaming journalism should be ethical. And you're like, of course, journalism should be ethical. But what they don't understand is that that's built into the practice of journalism itself. It's not journalism if it's not ethical, and if it isn't ethical, it will self-correct.
And the thing that they what they were using that for, like what they were specifically referring to, which I don't want to get into the details right now if we can avoid it, but is fabricated. It's basically false. Like the thing that they were highlighting as an ethical violation is not something that even actually happened as they say it does. And yet, like I can point to all kinds of things having, been in that world of where I think that there are like ethical issues that exist in how games are covered. Like for instance, how like games reviews are often kind of expected to function as an extension of PR and so on, that are just kind of built into how the system is functioning right now. But like those really aren't, you can bring up those, and those aren't like what Gamergate even cares about or means when they talk about ethics in gaming journalism. It's pure. It's clear that it's just this smokescreen, really, to give it that air of legitimacy, but that it doesn't have any substance to it when you really kind of push up against it.
Right. And when they do kind of blow up about a, scandal like that, their targets are individuals, usually marginalized individuals, and through hate campaigns instead of what the job of a journalist would be, which is to, critique the corporations or talk about the art and critique the art itself. Instead, Gamergate seems to say, no, it's the journalists who are at fault, or no, it's the representation, the queer communities, that's the issue here. So it does kind of exemplify this miniaturized version of what we're seeing on the left and the alt-right, where you have kind of this central issue and you can both see it, but then depending on where you're getting your news from, whether it's from mainstream media or queer outlets, or whether it's from alt-right YouTubers, you're going to have a completely different worldview and understanding of these problems. And there's fake news on so many levels, and that outrage is fueled on YouTube and in other small communities online.
Mm-hmm. Paolo, just to turn over to you for a second, because I know that academics too were sort of in the middle, in the heat of Gamergate back in the day. How, from the academic vantage point, how did that play out?
Well, yes, of course, academia became one of the targets at some point. The elite, if you like, of the ivory tower of academia became one of the targets of Gamergate. I know of many of my colleagues who have been targeted by gamer gators. It was quite bad. Of course, not as bad as the most notorious stories of like Anita Sarkeesian and many others. But in a sense, I think what Carolyn was saying, it's perhaps the most worrying and troubling legacy of Gamergate is that really work as an experiment for what later became the strategies of the alt-right for online mobilization of protest. And it really kind of identified this target, this group of people who are feel disempowered, and maybe they always felt empowered or legitimized to be in power, and now feel disempowered, and they need someone to blame. And it's very easy to see how the same narrative can be reapplied in the Brexit vote or in the Trump election, how it was reenacted shortly after, and how it still is in many other contexts. Fake news, it kind of followed the same strategy of using it's difficult on social media to write about something by critiquing or disliking that thing without making it popular at the same time, because for the simple reason, if you tweet about something and use that word, you're gonna make it even more popular, make it even more as a trendy topic. Gamergate was perfect in that sense. If you look on Twitter and try to understand what Gamergate was about, you will find all sorts of different opinions, but they were all kind of fueling and contributing to making it even more a thing, even more important. If we can maybe look at this story with a little bit of optimism, and I know it's very difficult to find optimism in this, is that in a sense, reconnecting to what we were saying before, misogyny in game culture has always been, I think, it's always been a part of computer culture. It was kind of inherited from that. There are many occasions, many examples of forms of discrimination in based on gender in the game industry. Gamergate actually arrived at a point when these examples of misogyny became, no longer, they couldn't be hidden anymore. They were so obvious and so blatant. After that point, though, those dynamics and strategies, I think, thanks to Gamergate, became a bit easier to identify or to point to. So Gamergate has been also used, I think, in the following years as maybe as an empowering keyword to point to those dynamics, to really look at them not in isolation, but as part of a much broader and historical problem that game culture has with misogyny. So in a sense, it's easier perhaps now to look at this thing, to point at them, which of course does not mean that they're going to end if we know that they're happening, but at least we know that they're happening. They're not isolated cases. They're part of a much broader history. I remember, just to mention, going back to like an academic contribution on this, in the weeks following Gamergate, a game scholar, Aaron Trammell, was writing on a blog post looking at some of the ways in which in the mid-70s, the community around Dungeons and Dragons, the role-playing game, were trying to identify strategies to be more inclusive towards women by changing the design of the game. And their strategy was to make a more realistic simulation. And the idea of realism was there mobilized to create, for instance, the possibility of choosing a female character. So you can be a warrior, an orc, an elf, but you don't have to be just male as the standard. You can also be a female version of it. But to make it more realistic, of course, your progression was kind of adapted to your presumed genetic conditions. So for instance, if you're a warrior, if you're a female warrior, you can only upgrade up to a certain level. And of course, a male warrior will always be stronger. But if you're a magician, you're more likely to make better potions than a male magician because you're better at cooking, basically. So this is one of the examples how game culture has even in the attempts of being more inclusive, has always kind of repeated the same heteronormative assumptions in a context where, of course, the design of the game was, it's hard to make a more inclusive design if the people who are making the rules are the same people who made a very exclusionary game in the first place. So, of course, these changes in the design of Dungeons and Dragons never really encourage any woman to play the game, but they work maybe also as an excuse or as a form of tokenism, let's say, to say, okay, look, actually, this game is actually very welcome. You can be a woman too. And this also respects your genetic condition as a woman, where you are not very strong but good at cooking. So that's an example that goes back in time where we see the same dynamics. But maybe at the time it was more difficult to really identify them and say, okay, this is an example. This is exactly like Gamergate. I think now we can do that. I think it's a bit easier to fight against these issues and to think of better strategies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I find it really amusing, just quickly, the way that the idea of realism continues to be sort of weaponized by the right, or would-be Gamergaters today. Games routinely have, even those that aspire to some kind of quote-unquote realism often have all kinds of unrealistic elements, like the amount of stuff that your character can carry around, or just the fantasy elements of the world that the game might take place in, etc. But gamers, some gamers can accept a great deal without blinking an eye, as when it comes to sort of game mechanics, etc. But you create a fantasy world in which patriarchy doesn't exist, and that's like unrealistic, or that's like a bridge too far. Like, you can't, why aren't women treated such and such? Like, they cannot conceive of a world without patriarchy, because patriarchy is viewed by many as some sort of intrinsic, natural part of the way that human beings relate to each other, and not as a human constructed system that affects the ways in which we think about gender and relate to ourselves and each other. What we're willing to accept and not accept as realistic, it can be very revealing.
So I'll sort of group these together, but 2 questions on Gamergate from the audience. One, which is, did Gamergate spark or renew academic interest in video games, maybe from kind of a wider angle of violence or game mechanics? And then also, will younger gamers kind of carry the biases and the hangups of Gamergate, or sort of what does it look like for newer gamers who are coming in right now?
I mean, to speak to the second question there, I think it remains to be seen, really. I mean, I think that certainly it's not as if sexism has been eradicated in media by any stretch. It's not as if games being made today, while they may be marginally better and include more options to play as women, and, don't just sexualize and objectify women as a matter of routine to the degree that games did in the past. Like, we can still identify all kinds of, we live in a sexist and misogynistic culture, and as long as our media is going to continue to reflect that, I do think that I'm hopeful that future generations will continue to kind of move the needle with regard to that stuff, further away from a baseline of just like pure concentrated misogyny. But I also want to say, and I think I said this in my interview with Red Pepper Magazine, that like we cannot rely on mainstream blockbuster media to do the work of liberation. Like, as much as YouTubers on the right may, again, like get outraged over like a minuscule bit of queer, trans representation or whatever in some game, like the reality, it kind of goes back to what was being said earlier about like checkbox representation of, you know, when the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like includes a gay character for 20 seconds in an MCU movie, like that's not, to me, progress or liberation. That is actually, in some ways, it's the opposite. It's the mainstream cultural apparatus establishing the limits of like what you can ask for and what you can expect as a marginalized person. Like, oh, here, you've had Black Panther, so, you know, you should be satisfied now, or whatever. So it still is upon us as, you know, as queer people, trans people, you know, as people who exist outside of the cultural, like, mainstream privileged groups, to create art and media and games, films, etc., that radically center and humanize ourselves, because the powers that be, the mainstream powers that be, are never going to do that, at least not until they absolutely have to in baby steps, because of the pressure being generated from the outside.
Yeah. And as far as the second question, just to add to that cultural question about how young people will be affected by video games today in Gamergate, it is a tough question to ask because, again, games are so dynamic and large, and like any media form, it really depends on what type of games they're consuming. I think, you know, after quarantine started, one thing was I went back to multiplayer competitive games just for a little bit, because that's like a comfort food and really easy to chew on. But that's also where one of the spaces where competitive spaces are where heteronormative men are kind of taught that they're allowed to seek catharsis and yell and scream and cry and be angry. And so that's also the most likely place in video games to find slurs and homophobia and just absolutely awful politics. And it was almost comforting in the sense that I was like, wow, none of you have changed. You know, there's a quarantine outside and everyone here is still as awful as I remember. But it's also concerning for the rising generation, because this is where alt-right communities know that young, vulnerable people will be there, and they can prey on them and kind of instill their politics and impress on them things outside of the view of parents. So it is a question of just knowing what young people are playing, but also just kind of giving them a taste of other games and other cultural moments and games to read. There are better, more diverse games out there to take in, and I think as long as young people kind of are able to sample and get a sense of games in a larger sense, that hopefully, you know, it's a positive message to take forward.
If I can say a word about the question about the academic interest, well, in game studies, there has always been interest in gender and representation of gender in games. And of course, after Gamergate, there is even more an interest and curiosity about, you know, gender in game culture, in the game industry. I would say that certainly Gamergate has reached far beyond game studies, and it has shown that, you know, game culture is undeniably part of our contemporary politics. It is part of our culture. It really affects many other areas that are, you know, go well beyond the realm of digital entertainment. I think that, you know, the connections with the alt-right are an example of, you know, that can no longer be denied, that certainly, you know, game culture and what's happening in gaming, it's influencing in our conception of politics nowadays.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we've been really talking about kind of games as in kind of a narrative, as kind of a narrative form, but there's also the kind of the back end of the games, which is all the labor that goes into it. And Paolo, you've sort of written about this in your article, that oftentimes we get the cartridge, or we download the game, and we sort of see the front side of it. We don't really see the kind of growing over-reliance on outsourced labor, growing over-reliance on freelancers, these so-called crunch periods that force a lot of game makers to work absurd and crazy hours. And so the game industry itself, which has gone through a lot of shifts over the last couple of decades, there's been this rise of the indie gamers. There are platforms that now make it easier for many of us to make our own games. But now the industry has also been a site of massive organizing. And we've seen some huge labor organizing efforts over the last few years in the US, in the UK, but also globally. So I'll sort of open up this debate around, what shifts are we seeing in the industry, and are there kind of, is there a promising future for the game industry in the context of neoliberal capitalism in which we're all living, operating, and breathing?
Yes, I think the future is promising, or at least I think we have to believe that it is. But there have been, in the past 2 years, there has been a major change, which I think is probably the most significant change in the recent history of the game industry, which is the foundation of Game Workers Unite, which is this global organization for organizing workers in the game industry. Which has resulted in the United Kingdom in the establishment of Game Workers Unite UK, which is one of the very first labor unions of the game industry. So let's say that forms of exploitation in the game industry and forms of protesting and rebellion have always existed. They've always been around. There are many examples in history. You can go back to the quite recently, about 5 years ago, voice actors went on strike. Voice actors are workers that we don't really see very much in the official accounts of the game industry. We can hear their voices in games, but we never hear what the workers actually have to say about their working conditions. And precisely because of this invisibility, they're very often subject of exploitation. So there has been a strike. That's an example. If you go back in time to 2004, there was a famous example of eSpouse with the wife of a worker at Electronic Arts who published this anonymous letter exposing the working condition of her husband, claiming that you cannot ask anyone to work for 60, 100 hours per week. And that creates huge problems on the worker itself, but it also creates problems on whoever is living with them. So if you have someone who is, if you have to stay at work all the time, of course, all the caring responsibilities have to be on the shoulder of your partner or someone who is staying at home. And that letter really exposed these things that everyone knew inside the industry, but no one was really talking about it. But all these occasions were quite isolated in the sense that they happened, they were kind of exposing things that everyone knew. But what's really happening, I think, with Game Workers Unite is that now all these forms of protesting, they have a place where to go. They have an association, a group of people where to seek support. Legal support, first of all, in defending your own position if you believe you have been treated unfairly, but also moral support, which is important, knowing that your case is not isolated. There are many others who are experiencing the same conditions. So you don't have to run away from the industry, because that's what's happening. That's also something that we don't really talk about it very much, but in the game industry, there are almost no one who is older than 35, if not in HR, management, and marketing. Because if you work in the actual production process of a game, by the age of 35, you're burned out. There has been a report published by an association, Take This, that looks at the mental health issues in the game industry. And among the most horrifying things that they are kind of unveiling, there is also these statistics, which I think it's very telling. On average, a worker in the game industry changes 2.2 employers every 5 years, which means that no one is staying in the same company for more than 2 or 3 years on average. This means that they are probably subject of forms of exploitation or unfair treatment. And the easiest thing to do is to go somewhere else, and then at some point simply leave the industry. which is a problem because it means that all these people who are experiencing problems, they never really reach a point where they can, organize their company in a way that is more fair and less exploitative. It also means that there are no senior positions who can mentor younger workers and prepare them for these problems. So it's an industry that keeps repeating the same problems. And that has been hugely problematic. There is big hope, though. I think Game Workers Unite is what was really missing at this stage. And it comes at a time where, in my opinion, in my experience when talking with people who work in the industry, many of the myths and beliefs of the game industry are starting to shake. The idea that you need to sacrifice everything, take all the risk associated with this career, be passionate, and being passionate means that you need to accept any work conditions. Well, all these myths are really, no one really believes in these things anymore. They're really starting to reveal in all their implications, which are awful, and they never lead to a more rewarding career or to better and more creative video games. It never happens. It only leads to mental health issues. So I think there is a change in the general understanding of what it means to work in the industry. Game Workers Unite is certainly happening at this time, probably also as a consequence of this change in how these sort of careers are perceived. So I think we can be optimistic. I hope so. But yeah, we will have to see.
It's interesting because it seems like as labor has shifted, the profit-making equation has shifted as well. And we have a question sort of in this vein from Rob Schofield on the phenomenon of loot boxes and buying in-game credits, and how sort of gamers, especially gamers who play online, having to sort of continue putting their money into games. So it's no longer that you purchase a single game, you put the cartridge in, or you purchase an Xbox Live Pass and then you just play. It's kind of like the industry just kind of keeps, both on the consumer side and then also on the worker side, kind of keeps taking a bit more. So I guess what's your take on loot boxes and kind of the shifting economic equation of the industry?
Well, I mean, it's one of the examples of an ongoing connection between game design, particularly contemporary game design, and gambling, really. And you can see that also in the many freemium games that are freely available for smartphones. Very often they are free because they use the same strategies of gambling, and they hook the player into create a form of addiction, and then they get money through microtransactions. And loot boxes are exploiting a similar dynamic. There have been attempts at regulating this, and some countries have actually explicitly have intervened in relation to loot boxes. It's part of awful strategies, really, at trying to take money out of consumers and to kind of keep generating money out of a video game product. There needs to be, I think, of course, more regulation on this, but also a better understanding, I guess, on the side of the consumers, that we are also not really used to this. When we buy a video game on a console, or if you download a game on a smartphone, we probably, most consumers don't really think or associate this with something that can make you addicted, that can actually keep taking money out of your pockets in a way they are not really in control of. So maybe there needs to be more awareness about this.
Yeah. And I think loot boxes are kind of in their, sorry, there's an echo there. Loot boxes are kind of in their twilight years. We've seen a lot of pieces covered by journalists and a lot of justifiable outrage from gaming communities about the way this mirrors gambling and kind of encourages young people to gamble. But it's also just the latest iteration of a constantly repeating pattern where gaming companies are trying to milk consumers for all they're worth. So, it used to be pre-orders were something they would always lean into and include as much little trinkets or valueless skins there, so to urge people to spend the full $60 or $70 or £50. And then there was also DLC that would come attached, downloadable content that could be deemed necessary to get the full story of an important single-player campaign. And now we have the rise of games as services, where these are games that might come with a nominal fee of like $10 a month that can run up over time. And so they're always providing new content and new seasons and schedules to keep people paying that monthly fee, and then also on top of that buying loot boxes or DLC or skins. So it's something that is getting better as far as loot boxes in the immediate, but it's also something that I absolutely expect we will see another iteration of in the new generation.
I think one sort of looming topic we haven't talked about, and someone in the comments alluded to it, is this kind of historical and current relationship between the military and the video game industry. And in some ways, it's a relationship that is symbiotic, but it's not as overt as simply dismissing certain games as military propaganda. Although there are many games like America's Army that were specifically created for the purpose of either training new recruits or being able to sort of do the rounds at recruitment events, which kind of showed the more the more friendly side of the military. But the relationship is quite long, and I think it sort of exists in the context of the military, especially in the U.S., being a driver of technology and innovation. But kind of research shows us that the relationship has gone back and forth, right? So sometimes military being a big driver of tech and innovation, and then sometimes the military borrowing from video game technology. I mean, the fact that we now see drones being piloted through Xbox controllers or Wiimotes, I think is very telling in that vein. But I guess my question for all of you is, this relationship between the military and the gaming industry, it's long, but is it something that we should be concerned about? And is there, are you seeing kind of a countervailing force?
I mean, I'm concerned about all the ways, like in which the military, in the U.S. is sort of mainstreamed and normalized, like the relationship between the NFL, and the military, for instance, and films do a lot to propagandize our military. Certainly, and I didn't really prepare. I didn't research this like I should have before this conversation. But games like the Call of Duty games, for all their like gritty realism and elements that can be spun as like critical of war, because they may sometimes toss a quote up on screen that's like, "Oh, war is hell" or whatever. Like, obviously, function for a great many players to normalize, I think, American military imperialism. They're often, the games are often set in, have been set in like unnamed Middle Eastern country or whatever, these kinds of things. Of course, all of this is concerning, and certainly the ways in which video games, mainstream video games, play into that kind of machine are no exception.
Yeah, I think what Carolyn said about realism is really telling, because it tells gamers that our idea of realism is, developers going to going to a military base and shooting as many guns to get the exact audio file of these military weapons resounding in their ears. But one game I played in the last week is called Disco Elysium, and it's a relatively non-violent game, and no spoilers, but there is a small outbreak of violence later in the game, and it felt real, even though it's a sci-fi game, because it was confusing. You weren't quite sure what was happening. There was no certainty in who would live and who would die, and that is more telling than, say, shooting a target until a red X appears on them and it's a confirmed kill. That tells young people and that the military deals in absolutes, and killing and violence is not even close to as certain as the military would want you to believe.
I despise games like Call of Duty and the entire franchise. However, I do sort of get irked, I think, at the disproportionate amount of anger that is dedicated towards Call of Duty, when I think maybe what both of you are speaking to is that these narratives of imperialism or kind of more militarized narratives are embedded in games that have nothing to do, at least overtly, don't feel like a war or military first-person shooter. I mean, there has been a spike in first-person shooters since 9/11, and it's not really a coincidence, right? Culture sort of mimics the zeitgeist and vice versa. Our politics are deeply embedded in culture, and our culture is deeply embedded in our politics. But I think a game like Civilization, for example, which is a strategy game where you get to sort of pick a tribe and kind of build out your specific civilization, and the one that you pick sort of limits your choices over time. The idea that game doesn't play into Western exceptionalism as much as Call of Duty Modern Warfare, I think is probably false. Right? These narratives are deeply embedded.
I mean, if the relation between the two areas, the military and the entertainment industry, really go back in time. In the early 80s, the game Battlezone by Atari was directly used by the US Army to frame one of their military simulations in what is known as the military entertainment complex, which is essentially an historical shift in recent history, where the research and development in the military sector and in the entertainment sector started to talk with each other, to essentially become one and the same thing. I always show to my students a recent article that apparently in the British Navy they are using an Xbox controller to teach to the new soldiers how to manipulate, how to play with the digital simulations of that they have in their training sessions, because the Xbox controller is what the new recruiters are familiar with, and they know how to use it. It's the most familiar interface that they have to manipulate images on a screen. So in a sense, then the mentality that you use in both contexts becomes almost indistinguishable, becomes one thing. It's a technological, ideological, aesthetic influence that kind of keeps going back and forth, essentially.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because you bringing up the British context, but I remember when the British Army had a bit of a botched marketing campaign, because they ended up sneaking in, like in an army magazine, pre-packaged with an issue of PlayStation Magazine, and there were a ton of outraged parents that were like, "What is this?" And it was like, I think something about the army wants you to get your game glow on. So you had all of these horrified parents, but it's interesting how we're seeing sort of, maybe this is a good transition, but we're seeing on the one hand kind of the alt-right and white nationalists kind of fighting for the loyalties of gamer communities. We see the military and the army kind of using esports as a potential recruitment tool, doing things like this ridiculous advertising campaign, also kind of fighting for the hearts of gamers. But it sort of seems that the left, or our progressive movement, have really been asleep at the wheel. I don't know of too many initiatives that are specifically focusing on, actually engaging with gamers and gamer culture. So, I'll sort of open it up to maybe the more positive and optimistic side of what can we do? What should be the role of the progressive movement in actually engaging with gamer cultures, engaging in video games? That's not just like, oh, let's put an educational message into a game, or like let's create a game about climate change and actually it's not fun to play at all and no one wants to play it, right? It gets, maybe 20 or 30 downloads.
If I can jump into this question, I think it's that's really the challenge that we have as makers and writers that engage with game culture these days. I mean, the beginning of like computer culture in itself is very much intrinsically connected with political critique. The famous book by Fred Turner, From Counterculture to Cyberculture, really shows how at the very beginning of computer history there was a strong skepticism in colleges in California, for instance, because computers were seen as the tools of the military. And technically that was correct. It was a sort of domestication of a technology that started in the military context. And then slowly there was a passage towards a more empowering perception of computers. And of course, the Silicon Valley was absolutely important in that transition. So that cyber culture became a cool thing, something that was actually empowering for, connecting with people of different, from different geographic contexts and so on. But technically, it is correct. I mean, when we play with computer technologies, we are playing with the same technologies that are used in a military context. So making video games is a way of turning these technologies onto themselves. And it's a perfect context where to imagine a critique of those ideologies that start and are intrinsically connected with these technologies. Even what is usually claimed to be one of the very first video game, Tennis for Two, which was a sort of an experiment with a mainframe device in a research center, is effectively an example of what video games can do. These are technologies that can be used to make nuclear energy in a military context, but they can also be used to entertain. And for wasting time, essentially, which is, I think, in itself a political act. And that was what Tennis for Two was, exactly that. It was a way of wasting time with a technology that was financed by the U.S. military and the U.S. defense program. I think we need more of this.
And I think as far as positive examples or of what the left can be doing in games, ultimately, at least so far, Gamergate, they have had political ramifications on a large scale across the world, and you can see that. But as far as how they've affected the dynamic of games directly, it seems like they're losing the battle, because we are seeing marginally better representation and more character diversity in AAA games. But then on a much larger scale, on the indie market, with the digital marketplace, we're seeing a lot of smaller companies or just one-person projects get developed that are directly political or that speak to individual experiences on a much more personal level. And thanks to the digital marketplace, they can get mainstream success. So even at the Video Game Awards, which is like an insufferable annual award show with, multi-million-dollar trailers and celebrities galore, one of the winners for narrative and best indie game was Disco Elysium, that game I mentioned previously. And when the people went up to accept the award, they thanked Karl Marx. And that's a game where, you know, everything is political, because when the lead writer was being interviewed for a panel, he said, you know, the reason why I put politics in games is because any world and any action is political. So the game makes fun of any political ideology, but the one that it comes down hardest on is centrism, the idea that you can just take the middle path and not really say anything. And, you know, the work that Carolyn's doing at Feminist Frequency, or that you see at Rock Paper Shotgun in the UK, those are communities that are uplifting these smaller indie games and really bringing feminist and queer critique to the fore, and showing that, carving out their space to say that this is an important way to engage with video games and show, as we've already shown, that they're art, but also that they're worthy of critique and worth uplifting in that way.
Great. I know we have, we're 6 past the hour, and I'm wondering if we could, I'm sure we could keep this conversation going for a really long time. And we had a lot of great questions from the audience, but you know, you brought up Disco Elysium, Jamal, but what other games, like what should we ask folks to download? Like, what are your favorite games that you're playing right now, that you feel like are on point with character development, with narrative, that are fun to play? Like, what should our audience be downloading?
That's a huge question, because, you know, everyone's tastes are different and dynamic. I'm personally somebody who's very driven by narrative and personalized storytelling, and games that kind of closely engage with social change or political values. So in my article, I highlighted Night in the Woods, which is one of my favorite games, because it speaks to me personally, because I'm a college dropout, and so is the main character. And, you know, just kind of coming home and reconnecting with old friends and kind of holding that shame and figuring out how to compartmentalize or, you know, badly express that shame was a huge part of my life. There are also games like the one that Carolyn's written about, Kentucky Route Zero, which is about kind of Americana and really talks about the effect of poverty and how it can also shame lower income communities and make it feel like it's their fault, that it's their debt to carry across the frontier, instead of, you know, it's the fault of corporations and it's the way the system is built. And I guess the only other one I would highlight is Papers, Please, which is a game that I think is really easy to get into, and is pretty systems driven. So it's addictive in that way, but it's also a way to gamify the immigration system, which is not something you would think could be gamified, but it explores political ideas and tells a very interesting tale through these systems. So it's one of my favorites as well.
So for myself, like as a critic, I tend to want to complicate rather than simplify or reduce our relationships with games. Like I think that there, you know, can be a tendency among some to sort of write off certain games as like just all bad or problematic or whatever because of certain elements they have. And, you know, but I mean, so for me, I mean, I think, say, to take a huge blockbuster game from some years ago, say The Witcher 3, right? Which has tremendous problematic elements in its treatment of women and, you know, in a lot of its worldview, really. You know, there's definitely very valid criticisms to be levied against the game in terms of how it centers whiteness and like so much about the game. And yet, but I also think that we, you know, as players can find complexity and value even in the midst of a AAA blockbuster game like that in some of its relationships, in some of its depictions of poverty, of the struggles of working people in its world, and you know, oppression. You know, even if the game is not always entirely like successful. And I think that we sometimes, as maybe as marginalized people, as oppressed people, like that's often been our experience with media, is having to, because the mainstream is not going to always offer us stories in which our own selves are centered, or our own stories are centered or reflected, and yet, so to participate and to experience that world, we sometimes have to kind of do that extra work of like, well, I'm going to project myself onto this straight white male character, even if games rarely ask straight white male players to project themselves onto people who don't look like them. Like, we're so used to doing that work. And I think, like that's, as writers, as critics, maybe as people who aren't like making games ourselves, writing about the experience of being players on the outside and how we can still carve out some kind of space for ourselves and our experiences is, to me, part of the work, like of asserting that games are for us as well, of demanding that games do more to reflect people like us and our experiences, and things like that.
If I may, actually, I just wanted to suggest Kentucky Road Zeros, but Jamal said that before me, and that's because I thanks to the lockdown, I finally had the time to properly play this game. So it is available now in this new TV edition where you essentially get all the episodes at once. It's brilliant. It's great. It's experimental, provoking. It draws back on this tradition of interactive storytelling and referring back to many aspects of gamer and computer culture. And it also has this sort of underlying political aspect of relieving yourself of your burdens again in relation to society. It all presented in a very surreal and poetic way, which is it's brilliant. It's a game to be played, I think, during a lockdown, because it requires a lot of attention, a lot of reading. But if I may, okay, if I'll say a different one then, also because I think I might give the false impression of being too sophisticated with my taste in games. And actually, if I wasn't doing this live chat, I would be playing FIFA 20 with my friends. Because I recently got back to football video games, which I didn't play for a while, and there are some interesting things actually going on in these AAA mainstream games. For instance, what you can do now is to create your own character, your own player, and play as part of a team made by other players who are played by other friends or other online players, and you kind of develop your own character. You skill up as if it was a role-playing game, which I think it's an interesting shift in a sense that football is there seen much more as a game played by an individual rather than by a team, which you can easily connect to the neoliberal mantras of everyone is on its own. Well, that's quite literally what happens in football or soccer for Americans in FIFA 20. There are no more teams. It's you're just a player, and you connect. So you can even just be randomly associated with a team, and you will play for them with one game, and that's it. You have no connections, no relations with anyone. It's a very strange imaginary for someone maybe like me, who is used to think a bit more of football as a great sport, precisely because it's a team sport, because you need to create a solid connection with those around you. And there is also a story mode with lots of gender forms, interesting things about representation. I would be happy to read something critical about FIFA 20. I agree that maybe sometimes these games are simply overlooked by commentators because they think they're always the same. It's always the same kind of game being remade. But actually, there are some subtle but interesting changes that are introduced with every edition.
Okay, so I'll give my plug for, and you guys already mentioned most of the ones. I haven't played it, but I hear that Falcon Age, I mean, part of it's because I don't have a PlayStation, but Falcon Age is supposed to be a really interesting game that's also available for VR, that's got a very strong anti-colonial, anti-imperial storyline to it. And you are, I believe, in the shoes of an indigenous young woman who just got out of a prison camp, and she has her sort of fellow Falcon who sort of sits on your arm. And I'm sure that in a virtual reality experience is kind of amazing. And then for folks who maybe want more game mechanics or who enjoy platformers, I really liked Gris, which is made by a Spanish indie developer and is a sort of left to right scrolling game where it sort of takes you, it's almost like a meditation, I think, on mental health and depression, where you start out in a world that's got no color in it, and then as you sort of progress and overcome different obstacles, you end up sort of gaining more color. So the game is just really like beautifully designed with a lot of watercolor elements to it. Oh man, so many questions. Maybe we can take all of our best game suggestions and we'll publish them on Red Pepper. So then we will satiate everyone's appetite for them. So just to wrap up, I think we may have lost Carolyn, but Carolyn,
her internet's chugging. So
there she is. Great, we got you back, Carolyn. I'm just going to do a quick closing, and I may have promised us for doing an article with all of our best game suggestions on Red Pepper. But I wanted to just say thank you to all of our panelists. All of the articles that they wrote are online at redpepper.org.uk. Please, 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 if you like what you see, subscribe to Red Pepper so we could do more events like this in the future. Please donate. We are, a really, really small leftist magazine, and we're trying to really make sure that we pay contributors and that we're producing content that is radical and is, questioning and holding powers to account. So I'll put the link to subscribe for Red Pepper down at the bottom one more time. And thank you all again for joining us, and hopefully you liked what you saw.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.